Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. As mentioned just a few moments ago, thanks for joining us. This is an interesting topic and very topical at the moment and in the news. So we thought it would be a very good idea to bring an information session to you on this topic. I think, you know, three years ago, when the regulation changed and came out, Léon was our key presenter on everything GDPR back in those days in early 2018. I don't think we realized quite what a big topic it was going to be and how difficult it was going to be to actually implement into your business and to understand who's a data processor, who's a data controller and the likes. And I still think there's some confusion out there. I still don't think it's been particularly well communicated by the Data Protection Office, but these information sessions, I think, are very, very valuable to our members and non-members. There's a mix of you guys on the session today. But I think as a representative body, ISME has a responsibility to try and get that information out to you. And CCTV is one of those grey areas, I think. So hopefully we can clear a few things up for you today. So Léon, you're very welcome today. Thank you for you offering the services this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping, the usual stuff. I think after 16 months of lockdown, we're fairly good at it, but keep yourselves muted whilst Léon's talking. Any sort of questions, as I mentioned, pop into the chat. We'll run through them at the end. We have some questions that were sent in prior to today's session. We'll run through those first, and then we'll get to the chat after that. And I think Léon's due to run for about 45 minutes, and then we've allowed for around 20 or so minutes for the Q&A at the end. So Léon, over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Adam. As Adam's alluded to, I'm the CEO of Impact Privacy. Impact Privacy is set up specifically to help support SMEs in particular deal with data protection and privacy issues. We're an international business. We're based here in Dublin, looking after Europe and the UK. And we also have a presence in North America, looking after the United States and Canada. And we have a particular focus on complex privacy issues, healthcare, and the digital space. And CCTV is something actually that we deal with quite a lot. We deal with it with clients who have large numbers of CCTV for large sites or numerous sites. We've dealt with it for security businesses, and we've dealt everything from fixed cameras to biometric technologies in CCTV and body-worn cameras. So it's an area where we've had quite a bit of experience. So I suppose the first thing I wanted to do was to give you a bit of a health warning. And I always give this health warning because, believe it or not, we didn't write the GDPR. It's not my fault. So please don't shoot the messenger. But I'm not here to tell you that everything's okay, everything's easy, you can ignore the GDPR, and it's not going to be problematic for you, because that's not necessarily going to be the case. So the purpose here is really just to lay everything out for you and give you a really good insight into the things that you should be doing when using CCTV, and then give you an indication of how it might impact you if you get things wrong. Because ultimately, if you're using CCTV, hopefully you're using it for a good purpose, and you want to be able to ensure that you can use it for that purpose should the need arise. So really, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do here today, and frankly, just keep you out of trouble. But you can't talk about CCTV, and you can't talk about CCTV in the context of the GDPR without 5 minutes just discussing what personal data is and why it's protected, because fundamentally this is what we are talking about. So what is personal data? So personal data is information that relates to an identified person or somebody who you can identify from the personal information that you're gathering and putting it together with other personal information that you have gathered or put together. It relates to natural people, so it doesn't relate to companies or organizations. It relates to a person. And just as a note, this might not be entirely relevant to CCTV, it's important to note, in Ireland, this does not apply to people who are deceased. So a living, identified or identifiable natural person. And when you're talking about CCTV images, and you're talking about somebody's face, that is a direct identifier. And it's personal data, regardless of the fact that you may not be able to tell who the individual actually is, because that face belongs to somebody and it directly identifies them. So even though you can't say, okay, that image relates to Pat or John Joe or whoever it happens to be, it is still personal data. And in that case, the GDPR applies. And in that case, all that we're going to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so is going to be relevant to you in relation to your use of CCTV. So we've now got a better idea of what personal data is. What is personal data protection? So the first thing I really want to make clear, and this is something that we have to have long conversations about with people, is that personal data protection is not about security or looking after personal data so that it's not disclosed to other people. It's not information security, okay? Personal data protection has at its heart the protection of people's right to a private life through the European Convention of Human Rights. So it's about protecting our privacy as individuals. And that is embodied in the GDPR, and the GDPR has 6 fundamental data protection principles built then on a foundation of accountability, which means that we've got to ensure that those 6 fundamental principles are met. And those 6 fundamental principles really talk about ensuring that when personal data is used, it's used in a way that is fair to the individual whose personal data it is that we're using, the data subject, and that you only use it for very specific purposes that you've informed the individual about, and making sure that you don't use it for other things, okay? You have to then use the personal data on the basis of either the individual's consent or some other lawful basis that is set out in the GDPR. It's not a case of saying, I'm going to decide today that I want to use personal information for this. You've got to have a lawful basis for doing so. You then have, through the rights set out in those 6 principles, rights to access data, some rights to delete data, rights to transfer data, to stop personal data being used. There are other things as well, like making sure you don't use too much data, the data minimization principle. Making sure that once you have data, you keep it accurate and you keep it up to date. And if you can't keep it accurate and up to date, then you've got to delete it. You've got to make sure actually that you don't keep it for too long. So all of these things are about personal data protection. And as you can see, it's not about information security. Information security definitely is a part of data protection. It's about making sure that you keep personal data confidential, that you maintain its availability, and that you maintain its integrity. But it's much more than that. It's all of these things that you're seeing on the screen there. And all of these things have to be thought about and considered when you're implementing CCTV utilization in the context of your business and your business purposes. So we can encapsulate all of that in one fairly simple statement, which is, don't think you can just put up a CCTV camera, capture the personal data, and then use it in any way that you like, because you're not able to do that. And if you do that, then you run the risk of getting into trouble. You run the risk of not being able to use the CCTV, and you run into other risks as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So you really do have to think about this quite carefully if you want to get it right, and if you want to meet the objectives that you're trying to meet through the use of CCTV. As we go through the discussion this morning, there's 4 key terms that I might use. So I thought I'd better just let you know what they mean. And this is useful in the context of data protection and GDPR generally. So the first thing is data subject. So if I talk about data subject, I'm talking about the person who is being protected by GDPR. This individual is the subject of the personal data that you're collecting and using, whether it's through CCTV or anything else. And it's data subjects who are protected by the GDPR, and it's their rights that you're supposed to look after when using the personal data. And the GDPR is all about the processing of personal data, and frankly, putting it colloquially, processing is anything that you can do with personal data, from collection all the way through to its deletion and everything in between. And by the way, just a point worth noting, that can include creating personal data. So if you gather information and create new personal data with it, that's going to be processing as well. And if you're putting up the CCTV and you've decided what you're using the CCTV for, then you're going to be the data controller. And as a data controller, you, in effect, have the primary responsibility for ensuring the 6 principles of the GDPR that we touched upon a minute ago are met. So it's going to be your responsibility. But you may have third parties managing and using the personal data for you because they're providing a service. And we'll talk about some of those a bit later on. And they're called data processors. And they have responsibilities under the GDPR too, but they have responsibilities to you as a data controller. And you have to ensure as a data controller that they do what they're supposed to do and they're following the rules. It doesn't, by the way, though, include your employees. Employees are your employees, they are not data processors, but there are obligations that you have both in relation to the data processors and your employees. So as we go through, I might talk about data subjects, I'll certainly talk about processing, data controllers and data processors. That's what those key terms mean. Okay, so let's talk about getting the basics right and the CCTV. By the way, this is a topic I could talk about all day long, so I'm going to gloss over some things. I'm not necessarily going to talk in absolute detail about everything. I'm not going to go through the GDPR line by line. I'm going to talk colloquially about some issues. And of course, it's always going to be case by case what absolutely is the right thing to do. But we're just going to talk about some general principles here today. So the first really important thing to do, and it is the most important thing to do, is figure out early on what it is that you need to use the CCTV for. That is so important. You might decide that you're using it to support health and safety and ensure that health and safety is being monitored and addressed on a building site, for example. You might be using it for security purposes. You might be using it in the context of legal claims. But for whatever purpose it is that you're using the CCTV, you've got to figure that out really early on. And that's important because really that is the basis on which ultimately you're going to be deciding why the use of the CCTV in the context of health and safety or dealing with safety and security or identifying criminal acts or dealing with litigation, why the use of the CCTV is necessary and why it's proportionate. It's also important because once you've made the decision to say, right, I'm using it for this purpose, it can be really very, very difficult indeed to then decide, actually, I want to use it for something else because I've seen something on the CCTV. I now want to use it for, say, disciplinary purposes because somebody's taking breaks that are too long. If you've not from the outset said that's how you're going to use it, you're not necessarily going to use it for those other purposes. So you've got to get it right from the beginning. If you want to use it for disciplinary purposes, make that decision at the outset. Don't wait until you've seen images that you don't like to make that decision, because you're not likely to be able to use it at that point. So the decision about what I'm using the CCTV for, and I'm sorry to labor the point, is really very important. And it's very important to get that right from the very, very outset. And as I say, that's important because it goes to whether the use of the CCTV is proportionate and necessary. And this is something that you have to understand, determine, and document. So the first question is it necessary? Is it necessary to use CCTV in the context of the purpose and the desired outcome? Can you do things in a different way to achieve the same outcome? Are there different technologies that you can use? Do you need to use technology at all? Can you have some type of different deterrent, for example, rather than using CCTV? And that's an assessment that you have to make, because if the use of the CCTV is not necessary, then you're not going to meet one of the first requirements, or you're unlikely to meet one of the first requirements, which is the lawful basis of use, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then you've got to think about, okay, will the use of CCTV be effective? So you've decided it's necessary, you've decided the purpose that you want to use it for, but if it's not going to be effective, or it's not likely to be effective, or it's the least effective way of dealing with it, then actually you're not going to pass the test of the use of the CCTV being proportionate and necessary. And that can be challenging. So if putting up the CCTV isn't going to have any impact on what it is you're trying to achieve, you're not likely to be able to use it. And then you've got to think about, okay, do the benefits to me as the data controller, the business using the CCTV and making the decisions about how it's going to be used, do those benefits outweigh the privacy rights of the data subjects? Is it so effective and so necessary and so proportionate that actually those privacy rights are less important than my rights as the individuals? And you can see that in certain circumstances, actually, that third point is going to be difficult to achieve. If you're using too much CCTV, that's going to be quite problematic, because you're going to be using potentially much more CCTV than is needed for the purposes of that you've decided to use it for. So it's not going to be necessary. The overuse may not be effective. It's not going to make any difference. And the more that you put people onto surveillance, the less likely it is that your interests are outweighing the rights of the individuals. And that's certainly the case when the surveillance is intrusive. If you're going into areas that people really should regard as being private, so whether that's lavatories or changing rooms or places where people feel that they should be able to have an intimate space with somebody, then, you know, like a little booth in a hotel restaurant where they're expecting to have a private conversation, but you're being very intrusive as to that conversation, then the chances are that actually you are infringing on the rights of those individuals, because they would expect to have privacy in those types of areas or those types of situations, and they certainly wouldn't expect to have CCTV surveillance in those areas, particularly if it's not relevant to what it is that you're trying to achieve, which is why understanding what you want to achieve is really important from the outset. Equally, if the surveillance is covert, i.e. people don't know that it's going on, that's going to be problematic, because one of the clear principles of the GDPR is that people should know that their personal data is being used and why it's being used. And of course, covert surveillance, by its nature, will hide the fact that the CCTV or the surveillance is happening. And that might be permissible in certain very limited circumstances, usually in relation to law enforcement. but that's very, very unlikely to apply in any circumstances applicable to you as private businesses, and clearly is going to be problematic. And if, as part of your business, you have CCTV looking at public areas that are not in your control, and probably don't relate to the protection of the business or the other purposes for which you're using CCTV in the context of your business, that is going to be problematic too. And of course, the more surveillance of public areas that you have, the greater the implications of the GDPR on you as a business. So again, you have to think very carefully about what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What's the problem I'm trying to overcome? Therefore, what do I need to do in order to overcome it? And those three things that we talked about in terms of necessity and proportionality and the rights of individuals, has the balance been got right? And if you're doing any of these four things, the chances are that that balance isn't going to be right, and that's going to lead to difficulties a bit later on. Once you've determined that, you've then got to decide, okay, what's the lawful basis that I'm going to adopt in order to use the personal data and install the CCTV and start recording images? As I said earlier, you can't just do it. You have to have documented a lawful basis for processing, and you can't make those lawful bases up. There's a prescribed set of lawful bases. They are relatively limited in number, and frankly, there's really likely only to be two, but possibly a third one that will apply to you as private businesses. The first one is that the use of the CCTV may be necessary. Remember that word again, necessary, to comply with a legal obligation. So if you're using CCTV to monitor compliance with health and safety requirements and ensure that people are following health and safety rules, and you've determined that it's necessary to do that for the purposes of health and safety, by reference to your health and safety risk assessment, by reference to the legislation and that applies in relation to health and safety, and you've determined that it's proportionate to use a CCTV for those purposes because it's the most effective way of doing it, and really it's the only way of doing it, and actually the use of the CCTV is going to protect the individuals so that your rights as a business are not outweighing their rights of individuals, then you might use this lawful basis for processing, which you're then going to have to document. But again, it's got to be necessary. More likely, for other things, it may be that you're saying, look, it's necessary, again, necessary for me to use a CCTV in the legitimate interests of ourselves as a business or potentially a third party. Now, you can think of all sorts of legitimate interests for the use of CCTV, and you might do that, and you should do that as part of your decision as to why am I using CCTV? Is it effective and is it proportionate? But you would have to complete a legitimate interest assessment as part of thinking about whether actually it is in my legitimate interests to do this. Because when you use a legitimate interests, you have to ensure that you're not, those interests are not overridden by the rights and interests of the data subjects. That means you've got to figure out what your legitimate interest actually is. What is the legitimate interest I'm looking after? Is it because I want to ensure the safety and security of people who are on my premises? That would be a legitimate interest. But do you have that legitimate interest, and is it necessary to use a CCTV to fulfill that legitimate interest? Why is it necessary? Then you have to have a balancing test. Are those legitimate interests valid? And am I quite happy that they are not overridden by the interests of the data subjects, the people whose images I'm recording? Are their interests and rights more important than my legitimate interest? And you have to have actually thought that through and documented it. And as part of that, think about then the safeguards and compensating controls to ensure that the rights of the data subjects are looked after as part of that processing. That all sounds really complicated, and it can be complicated, but that's what the requirement is. If you haven't done that assessment, you haven't demonstrated that it's necessary in the legitimate interests of you as an individual, and that those legitimate interests haven't been overridden by the data subjects. And if you haven't done that activity and you can't demonstrate that the lawful basis for processing has been fulfilled, you don't have a lawful basis for processing, ergo you can't use the CCTV and you shouldn't have done it. The third basis of processing that some of you may be using is this one, consent from employees. So if you've got your little thumbs up sign and you're easily able to click it in the chat, see how many of you have sought consent from employees through the employment contract or otherwise for the use of CCTV on premises. Nobody saying anything. Okay, I'm going to assume somebody somewhere may have done, and I'm going to make that assumption because it happens and I see it a lot. Okay, and I see it quite often within employment contracts or some other documentation that an employee may sign at the beginning of the employment. This is true for all personal data processing of employees. It's pretty much impossible to get valid consent from employees for the processing of their personal data by the employer. Why? Because employees do what employers tell them. And therefore, when they're asked for their consent, the employees will do what the employer tells them because they think, gosh, I haven't got a choice, I've got to give my consent. But if you give your consent when you have no choice, that doesn't meet the requirements for consent under the GDPR, and the consent isn't validly given. So if you're asking for employees to consent to the use of CCTV or any other personal data processing as part of their employment contract or as part of some blanket form that they sign at some point during their employment, that personal data processing does not have a lawful basis, and you're going to have to think about changing that. So you've now adopted and documented your lawful basis of processing, and you've probably avoided consent. The next thing that you need to think about is defining a retention period. Basically, the rule here is twofold. One, don't keep the images forever. Keeping images forever isn't a great idea, whether it's all of the images that you collect or particular images. Because remember, one of the principles of the GDPR is that once you have completed the purpose of the processing, you have to get rid of the personal data. So once that purpose for processing the personal data has come to an end, you have to get rid of the personal data. You're not going to need an image forever. You've got to determine what the period of retention is and get rid of it after that period. The second thing to think about then is, okay, what is the right period? Frankly, the data protection authorities pretty much universally in Europe are saying 30 days is a good period. You can't rely, by the way, on just the overwrite mechanism on your system. Why? Because the overwrite mechanism on the system generally operates on the basis of how quickly the data card or the disk fills up. And depending on how you're using the CCTV, that can take anything up to 90 days. And if you're then completing a overwrite every 90 days, you're retaining the data for 90 days, and that may be too long. You have to come up with a period that is relevant and proportionate and necessary for your purposes, and that fits with the expectations of the data protection authorities. So beyond 30 days, that's going to be difficult, but it does depend on the purposes for which the CCTV is being used. And one of the things that you may want to consider is if there are particular circumstances where I need to extract particular images, what circumstances do I do that in? And once I have extracted those specific images, for how long do I keep them and why? Because you may have a separate retention period for those particular extracts for particular images when they are needed. So for example, If you're using CCTV to monitor health and safety incidents, a health and safety incident occurs, it's reported in the accident report book. You may have a procedure that says, in relation to that incident, we will download the CCTV if that's available, and the CCTV will be used as part of the investigation. You may need, therefore, to think about a retention period for the CCTV to support at least the investigation and the review of the accident as part of the assessment and perhaps a root cause analysis. So that needs to be considered as well. And it's not over yet, because now we've got to complete potentially an impact assessment. So it's advisable in all cases to complete an impact assessment. It's certainly best practice, but it's not always necessary. But it is absolutely required if the CCTV is going to systematically monitor a publicly accessible area on a large scale. So if you're in a business where you've got lots of premises that are open to the public, or you have lots of CCTV in public areas, or you're doing a lot of recording in public areas, you're much more likely to be required to complete what's called a data protection impact assessment. And that isn't an optional requirement, it is a mandatory requirement. It is something that you have to do. And the idea of the data protection impact assessment, in summary, is for you to be able to document and understand the risks associated with the use of the personal data and the impacts that that utilization will have on the individual, to ensure that the rights of the individual in the context of the use of the personal data is going to be protected, and that the use of the CCTV in this case is lawful and appropriate. So what does that mean? You've got to think about the risks associated with the whole life cycle of the CCTV, from collection all the way through deletion, and its use in the business processes. Thinking about the risks associated with the particular equipment that you have and the third parties who you use in business processes, whether that's people who are monitoring it, whether it's people who's reviewing CCTV for you, whether it's processors who use the CCTV as part of providing you with a mobile app. That has to be thought through. You've got to document again whether the processing is necessary, effective, and outweighs privacy rights of the individuals, and all the things that we've just talked about. How do you minimize the collection of the data and the retention period, and of course the controls that you're going to have in place to protect the personal right of data subjects, and finally dealing with data security risks. You can see that that's a really good idea to do anyway, because if you do all of those things, then you're going to really understand how the CCTV needs to be used. You're going to be able to show that you've thought about it, it'll be documented, and it's much more likely that your use of the CCTV is going to meet the requirements of the GDPR. It's absolutely essential that you do that where the CCTV is monitoring publicly accessible areas on a large scale. So if you're a big operator of CCTV, this is going to be really, really important. The other thing that you now have to do is tell people about the use of CCTV. Now, that requires more information than you may think, and there's all sorts of ways in which you can do it. First of all, they have to be put on notice that CCTV is being used. It's not enough that it's just obvious that it's there. You've got to specifically inform them, and it's really important that you tell them where they can get further information about the use of the CCTV. And then you have to provide them with that further information if they ask for it, and it needs to be available. And that further information is called a transparency notice. Some of you may know it as being a privacy policy, and you'll see the terminology privacy policy used quite a lot in relation to notices on websites. But it's important that you have a notice like that in relation to your use of CCTV. And as I say, it can be in your web page, it can be in a manual, it can be somewhere else. And what does it need to include? Well, it needs to include your details. It needs to include the details of the data protection officer if one is appointed, and in certain cases, it's going to have to be appointed and designated. You've got to tell them why the CCTV is being used and the lawful basis for processing. You need to tell them who the third parties are that you're sharing the footage with. You've got to tell them how long it's going to be kept for, and you've got to tell them about their rights. And if you can, you should also be telling them about how you keep the information secure. The requirements for the transparency notices, again, are very clearly set out in the GDPR. They're set out in terms of the content, so those ticks there, but it's also set out in the context of making sure that those transparency notices are concise, that they're legible, that people can actually understand them. In short, just doing that isn't going to be enough for you. Okay, that isn't going to work. So one of the things that you may have to go away and think about is, what does my transparency notice say? Do I have one indeed? Maybe I need to start putting one together. And how do I make that available to people? And how do people know that we're using CCTV? And we've done some really interesting things with some clients around the use of CCTV or CCTV technology, just to make sure that people are aware of its use and people are aware where they can get details of how it's going to be used and how their personal data is going to be used. There's all sorts of ways of skinning this particular cat. The transparency notice obviously can lead to people then wanting to exercise their rights as individuals. So one of the things you just need to think about in advance is, if somebody comes along and says, I want to see my personal data, or I want my personal data deleted, or I want you to stop using my personal data, how are you going to deal with that? Because thinking about that after the fact is going to create you a lot of angst if you haven't thought about it properly. And you have to bear in mind that if somebody asks you to do one of these things, you've only got a very short period of time to do it, a month. So as soon as somebody writes in, you've got a month to deal with it, in essence. So trying to figure it out after the event is going to cause you a problem. So think about it beforehand. The most obvious thing that you're going to get is, I want to see my personal data. Okay. And there's very limited, and we'll talk about the circumstances in which that does apply later, but there are very limited circumstances in which you can say no. But the really important thing is, okay, I'm going to have to disclose to the individual the CCTV footage that I may have of them, assuming that it's within the retention period. But you cannot disclose other people's personal data whilst doing so. So that means that when you provide the CCTV footage, you have to have gone through an exercise of ensuring that the identity of other people isn't disclosed. That may mean blurring out the footage where it involves other people and sending it to a third party to do that for you. You can't just send them the footage. And actually that can start to become quite expensive, because it's not necessarily that inexpensive to send your footage to somebody to have images blurred out. So these are things that you have to think about: who you're going to use, how you're going to do it, how's that going to work. Similarly with deletion, and deletion is particularly important when it comes to legitimate interests. If you've decided that the lawful basis for processing is, it's in my legitimate interest as a business, then actually the right for deletion can be exercised if the data subject has objected to the processing, i.e. says, I don't believe you do have a legitimate interest, and there's no overriding legitimate grounds for processing. That right to erasure and deletion can be applied. At the same time, an individual might come along and say, I'm objecting to the processing, and whilst I'm objecting, you can't use my personal data. So you have to stop using the personal data. You might be able to use it later on if you've managed to demonstrate that actually you do have an overriding interest, but in the meantime, you won't be able to use it. So you have to think quite carefully about legitimate interest, because if that legitimate interest doesn't exist, or that legitimate interest has expired, or the legitimate interest is overridden by the rights of the individual, that will allow the individual to object to processing or require you to delete it. So those are classic data subject rights, the objection and the deletion and the subject access rights requests that you're going to have to think about. And it's particularly pertinent in relation to CCTV because of the way in which CCTV is used. And I think you have to expect that over the coming years, people will get to know and understand more clearly what their rights are, how they can exercise them, and actually your ability to counter those rights. So that's why it's going to become more important to ensure that you've thought about it, more important to ensure that you've thought through how you're using the CCTV and why, and that that's all properly documented. Because if you've not done it properly, particularly the rights to deletion and particularly the rights to objection to processing are going to be capable of being exercised by the individuals, and that then is going to stop you being able to use the CCTV for the purposes that you want to. And finally, document everything. Write down what it is that you are deciding and your rationale, because ultimately, if you are challenged, be it by an individual or by the Data Protection Commission as a regulatory authority, they are going to want to see what you have done. It's going to be the show me, show me, show me principle. And ultimately, the GDPR has what's called an accountability principle, which is all about you as the business using the CCTV being able to show that you have applied the GDPR and documented things properly. If you can't show that you've done things properly, then you haven't done things properly. And you're also going to have to maintain what's called a record of processing activity. If you've documented everything properly, then frankly, you're going to, in effect, have that. And it's a requirement that's imposed on you regardless of your size. So make sure that you do that as well. So you're thinking, great, now it's come to the end of that. That's a lot to do. How am I going to manage that? Well, unfortunately, there's some other things that you need to consider as well. You're going to have a policy. Think about having a CCTV policy that very clearly sets out some of the things that we've discussed and why you're using it and why it's necessary and why it's proportionate. The policy can be really, really helpful in encapsulating all of those ideas and concepts and ensuring that your use of CCTV is done within a framework that meets the legal requirements, that it doesn't go off the rails. The bigger you are as a business, the more important it's going to be for you to have a CCTV policy to ensure that your use of CCTV on an ongoing basis is done properly. So please think about a CCTV policy, particularly for the larger businesses in the audience here. I also want to talk about data processors. You remember from the definitions earlier, the data processors are the people who are going to be using personal data for you on your behalf. And really, there's three of them. There's people who are hosting data for you. So you may have CCTV systems that are connected to the cloud where the information and the data is stored on the cloud. Those people who are providing that service to you are your data processors. And as data processors, there's certain things that you have to think about. It may be that you've got third parties, people like Netwatch, for example, would be a classic, who are providing a monitoring service for you. So they are looking at footage when an alert is triggered. When the alert's triggered, they start recording. They'll then write a report, and they'll send that report to you for you then to manage. They are data processors too. as are people who may be receiving footage from you and working on that footage for you as part of your use of the CCTV or responding to data subject rights. So these might be people who are deleting images on CCTV, who are attempting to track people through the CCTV, who are otherwise managing the CCTV for their particular purposes. They're processors too. And finally, I'm sure most of you will have some type of viewing app that allows you to look at particular cameras at any particular time to see what's going on. The owner of the app, the person providing the app, will be a data processor too. So those are three processors that you're going to likely to have as part of your CCTV infrastructure. So why is that important? Why does that matter? Well, it matters because for data processors, you have to have a data processing agreement in place. It's critical that you have an agreement in place that meets the requirements of the GDPR in relation to those data processors. It's a legal requirement that you have that relationship contracted, and the contract contains the relevant requirements as set out in the GDPR. I'm not going to go through those because that'll take even more time, but it's really important that you do that. So if you're using any third parties, make sure that you have a data processing agreement. Ask them for the data processing agreement and make sure you have that in your suite of documents relating to CCTV. And a data processing agreement has to meet certain legal requirements. It's not just a random piece of paper. You also have to make sure that you don't transfer personal data outside of the European Union unless there are specific safeguards in place. That's a very complex area of law, and the truth is that actually you're better off just making sure that the data doesn't go outside of the EU. That might be okay in relation to people here in Ireland who are giving you monitoring services, or perhaps might be doing review services. For cloud providers, it could be problematic, but the big area of concern that I have is in relation to the apps on phones which connect to the CCTV, particularly where you're using CCTV that you may have bought from a provider where the CCTV is really meant for domestic purposes. And that often happens where you've got smaller businesses who may only have 1 or 2 CCTV cameras. The problem with those apps is that pretty much all of them are provided by Chinese suppliers, and the data comes out of the EU into China and back out again. There's no control over where the data goes or what happens to it in between time. There are no data processing agreements. I've always found it very difficult to even get hold of these people, let alone find data processing agreements. And you've got no idea what they're doing with the personal data in between time. So you've really got to think carefully about the use of mobile apps. Use mobile apps that are really thinking about data processing properly, and not just about, here, I'm going to connect you to a CCTV. And you've got to identify those data processors in your impact assessment, in your record of processing activity, and you've got to identify them to a degree in your transparency statement. A health warning. I do, and I'm sorry if this applies to anybody here, but I get very frustrated with service providers who say they are GDPR compliant. And I see a lot of CCTV service providers saying we're GDPR compliant. GDPR compliance is a really very high bar. And we completely understand and get the risk-based approach to GDPR compliance. But a stamp of GDPR compliance in our experience, whether it's me or my colleagues in Impact Privacy, is that most of the time, these are the individuals who are least GDPR compliant. And the stamp of GDPR compliance indicates a complete misunderstanding of what GDPR compliance is. Often it's just thinking about information security. Often it's just saying, if you use us, it's going to be okay. My antenna go up big time when I see GDPR compliance, and in all cases it's been right for that to do so. So just take care. Now I'm going to give some apologies in advance because I know that there's possibly some CCTV vendors on the call. So a couple of statements here is not meant to address anybody in particular, but it's observations based on our experience. CCTV vendors, quite rightly, are there to sell you their CCTV solutions. They're not data protection experts necessarily, and they're not necessarily there to provide data protection guidance because it's a complex, difficult area. And frankly, it can be a barrier to selling CCTV solutions. So don't expect your CCTV provider to be able to give you the right advice and get it all correct for you, because actually it's not their responsibility. Okay, it's not the CCTV provider's responsibility or the CCTV installer's responsibility to get it right for you. Okay, they are not there to provide data protection guidance and to get the data protection right for you. It's your responsibility as a business. And because it is not their business to provide data protection guidance and solutions, quite often, and not deliberately in many cases, the advice they give can be wrong or inadequate, okay? Because they're not necessarily experts in the GDPR and how it is applied. It's not their business, so we can kind of understand it. So it's kind of unfair to expect the installer or the CCTV provider, unless they're a very, very big one where you maybe, and who are making claims around what they can do, it's probably unfair to expect them to do that. So as I say, and I know this answers some of the questions, you are responsible for compliance, not the vendor or the installer, and don't expect the vendor or installer to be able to do it for you or to do it correctly. Just want to talk about CCTV security briefly. Make sure CCTV images are kept secure. You've got to keep them confidential. So that means don't disclose personal data to people who shouldn't have it, or allow people who shouldn't have access to CCTV, don't let them have access. You've got to ensure that the CCTV images are not broken or destroyed when they shouldn't be destroyed. So you've got to keep them during the retention period that you've set out, because they should be made available to the data subject if they want them. And that's important around availability as well. So security means ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the CCTV images during the period of retention. And if anything goes wrong, remember, you're going to have to report that to the Data Protection Authority. The rule is, if you have a personal data breach, which is a breach of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, you have to report it to the Data Protection Commissioner, save in a very limited circumstances. So if somebody looks at the images when they shouldn't do, if you accidentally send the images to somebody who shouldn't have them, if you disclose them to a data subject without blowing out all of the other data subjects in the image, those are data breaches and you're going to have to report them. So that then is something you're going to have to manage. And all of these things suggest that actually it's a really good idea, potentially as part of your CCTV policy, to have some clear procedures around the collection and use of CCTV. They don't have to be that difficult. We do them all the time for clients, but you should have them, and they should talk about storage. They should talk about how you access and who has access and when, how they should be viewed and when. That's particularly important in the context of those mobile apps. How they should be used, which of course should be consistent with how you said you're going to use them, how they're transferred to third parties, and the security measures in place, and how you deal with data subject rights. The other thing I want to briefly mention, because I know that CCTV and biometrics sometimes go hand in hand, either as part of the CCTV, where the CCT itself can start to track individuals based on biometric measures through a particular location, or when you send them to third parties where they do that for you. I want to be very clear. If you're using CCTV and biometrics together, i.e. facial recognition technology, which allows the CCTV images to track individuals, either through your CCTV system itself or an app that you apply to it, or through a third party who provides those services, you have to understand that the use of that technology, as a rule, is prohibited. You cannot do it. There are some exceptions to that, but they're very limited indeed. It either requires the explicit consent of the individual, which of course you're not going to get because you can't get explicit consent from somebody who's had to walk past the CCTV camera. It may be that it's strictly necessary in relation to employment law rights, but that's going to be very limited as well. Or it could be because it's necessary for the establishment, exercise, or defense of legal claims. The point here, though, is that you have to think about this ahead of time. It's got to be reflected in your DPIA. You have to specifically identify why you need to use the biometrics. And the use of the biometrics has to be able to meet one of the very few conditions available in the GDPR for the use of biometrics, that facial recognition technology. If you can't do it or you haven't done it, you're not going to be able to use biometrics. And actually, the use of biometrics and facial recognition technology is a touchy subject for the Data Protection Commissioner and the European Union generally. So if you're using biometrics, this is definitely one of the risk areas for you. So if you're doing anything around tracking of individuals through your CCTV, whether through the system itself, through an app, or through a third party, be very, very cautious about how you do it. And now I want to talk about CCTV and its use in court. Can it be used in court? Of course it can. And it's important to know that the Data Protection Act, which supplements the GDPR here in Ireland, says in section 41 that yes, you can use personal data, provided it's necessary for obtaining legal advice in connection with legal claims or prospective legal claims, legal proceedings or prospective legal proceedings. So it doesn't matter the basis for its collection and use, you may be able to turn to the Data Protection Act and say, right, I've got a legal claim, I can use the personal data for those purposes, or for establishing or exercising or defending legal rights. Now, that is not just a blanket, great, I can use it now for anything to do with legal claims, because the point here is it has to be necessary. Necessary. And necessary is the word used a lot in the GDPR, and that means an assessment has to be taken. And it has to be taken in the context of the nature of the claim, the rights of the individual, and maybe the other evidence that you have in relation to the particular issue, or the other information that you have in relation to the particular issue, and also what is at stake, both for you and the data subject. And that's going to determine whether or not you can use the personal data. You cannot go blanket, great, I can use any personal data for these purposes regardless. For each piece of personal data that you're using, you're going to have to apply the test, that test of necessity. So it's a yes, but. And the but is, as I've just said, you can't use it for purposes that it was originally collected for as a blanket. You've got to apply it on a case-by-case basis. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that the data subject can't object to its use, okay? Because they can. And whether or not that objection is valid is going to depend quite a lot on how well you've done a lot of those things that we've talked about earlier. The more that you've done and the more you can show that your use of the CCTV has been done lawfully, legitimately, and in a way that meets the GDPR, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to use CCTV successfully in court action. So when deciding to use CCTV, back to necessity, proportionality, and lawful basis. Make sure you've thought about all the intended purposes of use again. If you're going to use it for these sorts of purposes, make sure that's documented, thought through, and made clear to everybody. What about disclosure or deletion of CCTV? Data subjects, and I know this is a hot topic, might want to see the CCTV through a data subject access request. Can I refuse it? Generally speaking, no, you can't, generally speaking, okay? But there is an exception in the context of litigation, which is that the Data Protection Act says that you can, in some circumstances, refuse disclosure or deletion in the context of legal claims. But again, that isn't a blanket. You have to think about it in a case-by-case, on a case-by-case basis. So there's a but, okay? You can't use the exception just in case the request is leading to a claim. That's certainly my view, okay? You can't do it just because you think a claim might happen or just in case a claim, okay? You've really got to think about it in relation to a claim that you know is contemplated or is in progress. So you have to think about that on a case-by-case basis. The withholding has to be necessary and proportionate to the claim. So again, it's not just a, great, I've got a legal claim, I know it's happening, so I'm going to withhold it. You've got to be able to demonstrate that it's necessary and proportionate in the context of that claim. Again, depending on the evidence and the other information that you have, the nature of the claim and the impact of the claim. Okay, that's really, really important. And so that's an area where you're going to have to correspond with your insurer or the solicitor dealing with the claim to say, okay, what do we think the position is here, and really think about it carefully. The data subject has to have been told clearly why you're withholding the personal data. And of course, that doesn't put to one side the litigation disclosure rules. So there isn't a blanket yes or no, but there's always an opportunity to withhold, but you can't use that opportunity on a blanket basis. You have to think about it case by case and get advice in relation to the particular claim that is absolutely contemplated or is in progress. Some consequences if things go wrong. Okay, you might not be able to use the CCTV footage. And we know from interventions from the Data Protection Commissioner, particularly around with county councils, and we've seen this in relation to Kerry County Council and Waterford County Council, if they're unhappy with how CCTV footage is being used, they're going to tell you not to use it, and they can say, ask you not to use it on a temporary basis until you get things right, or even on a permanent basis. And so getting things right means that you've got better prospects of being able to continue to use the CCTV footage, period, as well as ensuring that you can use it and manipulate it in the way you really want to. You cannot exclude the possibility that claims will come directly from data subjects in relation to the use of CCTV in a way that's wrongful. The GDPR specifically gives individuals rights to make claims against data controllers like you. I've certainly seen data protection claims being made in litigation as part of counterclaims, and those data protection claims being made successfully. There's absolutely evidence of it. And I do predict that where CCTV is being used in evidence, that actually over time, there's a greater prospect for claims and counterclaims to bring in claims around the unlawful use of CCTV, either to deal with a defence or to deal with the prosecution of a claim. So don't think that data subjects can only just go to the Data Protection Commissioner. I think increasingly you will see claims coming in either as part of bigger claims or maybe individually. And of course, in the worst case scenario, there's regulatory penalties. Frankly, we haven't really seen the regulatory penalties start to come through from the Data Protection Commissioner yet. But, and this is the big but, there are very good examples of CCTV penalties coming from Europe, which we may see the Data Protection Commissioner start to follow. And there's all sorts of political reasons why that might start to happen. And even if I look at claims that have been published in the last week, you're looking at fines from anywhere from a few €1,000 to the mid tens of thousands, up to the millions, depending on the nature of the breach and the size of the organization. So the regulatory penalties are real in Europe. They're real in Europe, in Ireland, to the extent that they can look to Europe and see how those penalties are being imposed and the impact of them. So that can't be and certainly shouldn't be discounted either. So just to round up, before we do some Q&A, think very carefully before deploying CCTV. Make sure it's necessary and proportionate and lawful. Make it clear it's being used and provide that information. Make sure you're ready for dealing with data subject rights. Make sure everything's documented and you've got your appropriate policies and procedures in place. And by the way, don't just grab the nearest template, because you've got to think it through in relation to your purposes, your business, your operation, your CCTV infrastructure. So just grabbing a template and putting your name on it isn't going to help you. And of course, get help when needed. And there's all sorts of really good free information that you can use, right? Go to the Data Protection Commission, and these slides will be available so you can have a look at these. They've got a good couple of areas around CCTV and data protection impact assessments. And the UK CCTV Code of Practice isn't a bad starting place either to help you get your head around some of these issues. So there's free sources of help too that you can go to that can help you out. So I'm conscious that we're an hour in. I'm going to very quickly go through some Q&A, Adam, from some 3 questions that we had, if that's okay, Adam, and if everybody's all right for next
that's fine, Leon.
And then we can look at some of the questions that I've seen pop up on the chat. Some of them are quite long, so I haven't a chance to read them properly because I'm a bloke. I can only do one thing at a time. Let's just look at some really interesting questions that we've had submitted. So the first one is, can I use CCTV to spot disciplinary action? So, you know, I've got a CCTV in my store or my business, and I'm fed up with the employees standing around having cups of tea and not doing their work. Can I use the CCTV as evidence that they're not working hard enough, and therefore use it for disciplinary action? Okay, so I think the simple answer to that comes back down to making that decision at the very beginning as to why am I using the CCTV in the first place? And is that use necessary? And is it proportionate? The chances are, if I'm honest, you're not going to be putting up CCTV just to look at your employees' behavior, unless it's for security purposes. And I'll just talk briefly about that in a minute. If you are putting up CCTV just to make sure that people are working as hard as they should be, I'm quite comfortable in saying that that's unlikely to be necessary and proportionate. All right. So in most cases where we get asked this question, it's incidental. So we've got CCTV up for security purposes, but we happen to spot that an individual wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and so we want to use the CCTV for disciplinary action. So the real question is, okay, can I use it for that different purpose? Remember, I said at the beginning, once you've decided what you want to use it for, it's very difficult to then use it for a different purpose. Okay, so what that ultimately means is that when you put up the CCTV, have in your policy to say that we will also use it for disciplinary action, in relation to, or disciplinary proceedings in relation to disciplinary actions, even though that might not be the primary purpose of the CCTV. And there's some case law actually that discuss that very specifically, where the High Court said, look, if an employer has in their policy that if the use of CCTV also discloses disciplinary action and will use it for disciplinary proceedings, then that use will be okay. But if the policy doesn't say that, then it will not be okay. You could only use it for disciplinary actions related to the purpose that the CCTV was put up. So if you had the CCTV up for security purposes and you saw somebody stealing property, then the use of the CCTV for disciplinary action in the context of that theft would be okay, but it wouldn't be okay for disciplinary action in relation to something not connected with security. And as I say, if you were using CCTV just to monitor people's work performance, that's unlikely to be necessary and proportionate, and therefore the use of CCTV is unlikely to meet the requirements of the GDPR. I would say that as a general rule, but of course it's going to be case by case and specific to the particular purposes, but that would usually be our starting point. Can I get access to CCTV footage from a third party? Yes, you can, but, and there's always buts here, and it's going to depend case by case. It's not entirely ruled out, and I think there's two parts to it. Part number one is whether the third party has identified that the use of the CCTV is necessary and proportionate, and in the context of that use, then the CCTV footage may be provided to a third party. I think that's absolutely going to help. Equally, if the provision of the CCTV to the third party is wholly legitimate, then there may be grounds for providing it to the third party. And again, a relatively recent case that was documented by the Data Protection Commissioner in their annual report that came out in December of last year talked about the use of CCTV in a bar. There was a barroom brawl, and the employer of one of the persons involved in that barroom brawl wanted to obtain the CCTV. And on the basis of other European case law, the Data Protection Commissioner said, look, where there's a real legitimate interest for a third party to have that CCTV footage, in this case to take disciplinary action against an individual who had committed a criminal offence, then the GDPR shouldn't be used as a barrier to providing that footage to the third party. So there are circumstances where it can happen, but it has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't start with the premise that you can. I would start with the premise that you can't, but look for opportunities where you may be able to do so. If it's something that you feel you're going to have to do or want to do, that's something you're going to have to consider when you pull together your policies and your procedures and think about the necessity and proportionality of the use of the CCTV. And then transferring personal data to a third party, another controller, it's a kind of the same question, but the other way around. So I think the advice is fairly similar, and it's going to depend on the necessity and proportionality and the original purpose for the use of the CCTV. Again, unfortunately with these things, and it's a typical lawyer's answer, I'm afraid, as a lawyer, I give the lawyer's answers quite a lot. It does depend, and you do have to think about it on a case-by-case basis. It's not absolutely excluded. I wouldn't necessarily start with the position that you always can, because you can't, but there's certainly opportunities to do so in certain circumstances. And if you feel it needs to be done, I think that has to be thought through at the outset. And it's important to say that it's very difficult, once you've set it up, to backdate your thinking as to how it should be used. Of course, you can always do it moving forwards, but it's very difficult to say, right, I've now got this CCTV image, I now want to use that CCTV image for something else when you haven't thought about it. Really, really very, very difficult, which is why it's important to get it right from the very start. Adam, do you want to pick out one of these questions, or would you like me to do that?
Yeah, we actually had some sent in to us as well just prior, Leon.
Yeah, so those questions on the screen there, I think, refer to the ones that came in.
Okay, I'll just make sure, because Kira very kindly sent the questions through to me last night, so I'll just check to see that there aren't any that we haven't covered off there, if that's okay. I think most of them we've covered off, but there are some sort of quirky ones here, like, you know, how long and what form is better to hold storing the data? Would it be a computer system or a filing cabinet?
Yeah, I think that's more. I'm just going to stop the share now so you can get to see me. Lucky you guys. Yeah, I think that's more of a general question. So the security of personal data generally, you have to think about very much as part of the 6 principles. It's the 6th principle, making sure that once you have personal data, you look after it and you maintain its confidentiality, its integrity, and its availability, those 3 things. A filing cabinet may be perfectly fine, depending on the nature of the personal data, but equally, it may not be. If people have got too much access to it, what would happen if all of that data was destroyed, let's say in a fire, or what's the risk of destruction? What impact would that have on the individuals whose personal data it is, and therefore should you maintain copies? Well, that's why people put things on the cloud, and then you have backups, because if something happens, you've always got a backup. So, you know, GDPR doesn't say, right, everything's now got to sit on the cloud and it's got to be backed up. What GDPR is saying is, for the type of personal data you have, you need to have appropriate security measures to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of personal data based on, in effect, what are the most up-to-date state-of-the-art methods and what's sensible in relation to the personal data that you're processing. And that's using very colloquial terms as opposed to GDPR terms, but basically that's what it's saying.
Super, thank you. I'm just wondering sort of what questions you have had, but there was one that was referring to, was the question in there, we are leasing a 1-story premises in a yard? Have we covered that one off?
Yeah, I will address that one actually. It's probably dealt with through the whole presentation, and really the question is, I'm leasing premises, the landlord wants to put up CCTV and give me access to it. Is that okay? Because I'm worried that my employees' privacy may be infringed by that CCTV. So this all comes. So first of all, if you have access to that CCTV and you're using it, even though the landlord has put it up and they're the primary user, you're going to become a controller, potentially a joint controller with the landlord for that CCTV. So you may become jointly responsible together with the landlord for that CCTV if you're using it as well. And that means that working with the landlord, you have to make sure that all of those things that we've discussed are met. If the landlord, if you're not using the CCTV, then it's the landlord's responsibility because they're the controller. And the real question for the landlord would be, well, okay, have you done everything that you need to? Why are you using the CCTV? Why is it necessary and proportionate? What is it that you're protecting? Are you protecting you? Are you protecting me? What's it for? And start to ask some difficult questions. I think that my view would be, don't become a joint controller with the landlord, because you'll end up having exposure if the landlord gets it wrong. Make sure it's the landlord who's entirely responsible, and have a grown-up conversation with the landlord about, is this really appropriate and have you done things properly?
Okay, thanks, Leon. Perhaps we'll go to the questions in the chat there. I don't know if you've got access to them, but some of them we have covered off in detail. So thank you for that, Leon. You know, mainly around sort of responsibility of the installer versus the owner of the system, etc. But one here is, does a person requesting CCTV footage for a vehicle need to provide proof they own the vehicle?
Yeah,
I assume that's dash cam, is it?
Yeah, so okay, so dash cam is really interesting. So that dash cam you can split into two parts. Dash cam can be us putting dash cam in our private vehicle, because we want to make sure that if we're involved in an accident, that we can show our insurer, it wasn't my fault, look, here's my dash cam footage. Okay, now the Data Protection Commissioner, based on cases that have come up through Europe, has determined and made it very clear that their view is that using dash cam privately in a vehicle doesn't come under the household exemption. And the household exemption basically says if you're using personal data for your own private purposes as an individual and not in a business capacity, there's a household exemption under the GDPR. And they're saying, well, actually, dash cam isn't that, because you're out on the road and you're taking images of public spaces. I think that's a bit of a nonsense decision, but it is what it is. And that means that even as an individual, you've got to follow all of those rules, which, by the way, isn't going to happen. But it does have potentially an impact on how insurers may use that footage in the context of moving forward, in the context of an accident relating to a private vehicle. When it comes to dash cams installed on vehicles owned by businesses, particularly in commercial vehicles, then all the rules that we've talked about apply, because essentially it's CCTV, but it just happens to be in a van on a dash cam. Like you see the Tesco vehicles or other vehicles, you know, they've got CCTV not just at the front, but at the back and around the side. And you can go to the person who operates that vehicle and ask for the CCTV footage just the same way. If you believe that you've been captured on that CCTV footage in just the same way as anybody else. And it just reminds me, one of the things I didn't mention is, of course, if a data subject says, I want to see my CCTV footage, you're absolutely within your rights to say, okay, when, where, who are you? Because you can't be expected to give over all of your footage relating to a subject access request to somebody who you can't identify, and you don't know when the footage was captured. So it's an important thing, by the way, if somebody says, I want to see my personal data when it comes to CCTV footage, to say, can I see a photo of you so I can identify who you are in the CCTV footage, and can you tell me when and where? And if they can't tell you when and where, you may have the opportunity to say, well, I've got 30 days of footage and I'm not going to go through 30 days of footage. It's disproportionate. You need to be a little bit more. And that might give you an opportunity to say no. But all of those rules relating to being able to access the CCTV footage are exactly the same for dash cams as they are for fixed installations.
Yeah, and that provides some clarity, because actually Vincent, who asked that question, just popped into the chat there saying it was a CCTV system covering a car park in a shopping mall. So I think you've just covered that point there, Leon.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Vincent. I'm glad I managed to cover it by accident.
Very good. This one's a bit of a long one, but it's quite clearly written. So, if a business is reliant on the CCTV of a client's site for safety improvement or accident investigation purposes, how does one address a conflict of interest where the client uses GDPR to prevent sharing of CCTV footage of your employees due to potential liability on the client, when its stated purpose was for safety and security purposes of all users of the site?
Yeah, so this is back to can a, and I know precisely the context of this question, and the context of the question is, I'm providing services to a third-party business that involves my personnel being on that business premises, and of course that business premises has CCTV and it's capturing my employees as well as the employees of the client. And the question is, okay, when I'm dealing with my employees, can I rely on the CCTV footage of the business? And that very much depends on how the client in this case has set up their CCTV, the extent to which they've gone through the process that we've talked about this morning, what the purposes for the CCTV is, and the extent to which the need for the CCTV footage by the service provider in this case is compatible with the purposes for which the CCTV was originally collected. So just to put that into some context, if the client is using CCTV for security purposes, okay, but through that they've recognized that an individual isn't doing their work properly, then it's not going to be compatible and probably not in the legitimate interest of the data of the business of the service provider to receive that, because they're two totally different purposes. If it was in the case of, okay, I'm looking at it for security purposes and I spotted somebody committing a criminal offence, then it may well be legitimate and permissible to transfer it to the service provider, and that would analogous to the bar case that we talked about a little bit earlier on, because of the nature of the incident and the legitimate interest of the service provider in that instance, and that could provide a means for having the personal data transferred. Ultimately, and this is the big issue, ultimately that is going to be a decision of the data controller, the person who's collecting the CCTV, and getting them saving criminal cases, or forcing them, I should say, saving criminal cases to provide the personal data is going to be very tricky indeed.
Excellent, thank you, Léon. I think that covers all the questions that have been put into the chat there. Is there anyone there who's got a pressing question that's not in the chat? You've got a couple of minutes maybe just to ask Léon something.
Yeah, delighted to take further questions.
If not, don't worry. As I mentioned at the start,
hand up.
Are we good? Have we got a hand up? Can't see.
Or we can put a hand up.
Oh yeah, sorry. I haven't seen one go up there. So I think,
okay, great.
Well, I mean, that was very thorough, Léon, and thank you for providing clarity in a very practical way, because when you're reading all the sort of the websites and what have you and the documentation, it's very easy to get lost. So to actually hear it from a professional in such a clear and succinct manner is really, really helpful. This has been recorded. We will send the recording out. Leon's agreed for us to share the slides. The slides are obviously in the recording anyway, but a couple of things of note. Firstly, I know, Léon, you've worked with our HR manager coach on our policies and templates and what have you for our members. So there are some documentation, there's templates and policies, examples. If you're a member of ISME, you've got access to those as well. So that's another point of reference that you can make in your CCTV GDPR journey initiative. Also, we will send out an evaluation form. We'd love to get some feedback from you guys. It helps me and Léon just to improve our training services and information services. So please, we do ask if you'd fill that in. It takes 2 minutes, that's all. Léon, big thank you to you. Always good to engage with you, and thank you for your professional advice. We'll be doing more with Léon throughout the year and into next year, of course, so do keep a lookout on our learning page for further business advisory services. Lots of thank yous coming into the chat there, Léon. So I think it's been greatly received. Thank you once again, and thank you all for attending today's session. Have a good weekend, and we hope to see you all soon. Take care.
Very much, Adam. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.